Software Engineering Radio episode 13, Ruby in Practice. Welcome. This is the sequel to our episode on scripting languages. In that episode, we promised to have a second episode on this topic, more specifically on Ruby. And so here in this episode, Alex interviews Tom Quas. Tom is originally a Java enterprise developer, and in this episode, he talks to us about his experiences with his first Ruby project.
Hi Tom, could you please introduce yourself a bit?
Hey Alex, I'm a Java developer, and usually I help my clients developing enterprise systems, enterprise applications.
So how did you get to Ruby?
I was looking for an alternative to Java, and I was scanning the scene and found Perl, Python, Ruby, and all those kind of like scripting languages, and I just jumped into Ruby because I tried a few others of them before, and kind of was like disappointed from some, and others were like too complex, so I gave Ruby a try.
Mm-hmm. Have you had any prior experience with Ruby, or was this the first time you get into contact with Ruby?
Okay, so about 2 years ago, I had to develop a application for a client, and in order to do that, we had to provide a prototype. So within a time frame of about 2 weeks, we had to develop a rather complex state machine, a UI interface, and database connectors and stuff. We wouldn't want to implement it in Java because it would be too slow and too complex. And we looked for a scripting language. Mm-hmm. So we decided to use Ruby because we had everything that we needed, like this ERB embedded Ruby part for the UI interface. We had MySQL connectors and stuff. So we started scripting.
Okay. 2 weeks is a pretty tough schedule, I would say. Especially if you don't know the language, you have no prior experience. How did you start with Ruby? I mean, it's a new language, you have new frameworks, all technology is new. That's a huge thing to learn, I guess.
So we picked the most famous book that we could find at that point, and that was a pickaxe book by the Pragmatic Programmers. Just by reading chapter by chapter and going through the examples, we just were able within a few hours, or actually 2 days or something, to build up the basics of the application, and then learned more and applied it. And within 2 weeks, we could deliver that prototype. And that was like a pretty amazing experience.
I think so too, yes. What was your first impression of your Ruby? How does it look like if you have no prior Ruby experience?
Given that I have a strong Java background, and I was also working on Perl projects and a little bit of Python, which I never got into my brains for some reason. Like for an OO programmer, it looked pretty familiar from the beginning, and it wasn't actually hard to understand the syntax, and it wasn't quite complex to understand the standard library that comes with Ruby.
Yeah,
so
it's not so huge, at least not as huge as Java stuff.
Well, not yet, I'd say. Well, I mean, if you look at the Python world, they have lots of libraries, and actually I envy them a little bit about that. But, there is a lot of things that are coming up for Ruby, and you can be really productive, like, in no time. So, coming back to the book, we learned Ruby by the book, basically.
So, that Ruby is so, object-oriented from core was a thing you did like a lot and did help you to get into. What were the other things?
Okay, I guess I like the syntactical sugar that comes with Ruby, like, closures, or they call it blocks. And the very simple syntax, which is very reduced to what you actually need. And if you need more, you simply define it in Ruby. That's the beauty about the whole thing. So if you think in domain-specific languages or something, it's very easy to define your own keywords and your own concepts and embed it into the language.
Yeah, that's pretty different from Java. I think I have no prior Smalltalk experience, so this was the first language to me that had this embedded into the language, this strong emphasis on building your own language within the language. Pretty cool thing, I think.
Yeah.
Would you say Ruby is pretty major? I mean, you did a whole project in 2 weeks, had the first prototype working. It sounds like it just works. I mean, there are not so many commercial Ruby projects out there. So a lot of people, I guess, are a bit worried about the state of Ruby. They never heard before from Ruby. They hear from C# and Java all the time, but never from Ruby. How would you rate Ruby?
Well, I think Ruby has a lot of momentum since the appearance of Rails, actually. And a lot of people are jumping on that train. So I guess Ruby itself will mature from this, or will, benefit from this process.
Yeah.
Having that said, currently we're in the process of a Ruby language upgrade. So people will still modify the language, and with the 2.0 version of Ruby will face a lot of changes. So, I mean, chances are that your old programs will continue working with the 1.8 version.
Okay, the 2.0 version of Ruby is a huge leap, as I understand you. Do you think I mean, this is a pretty interesting point. We have languages that move very slow, and languages that really get huge updates in a short period of time. What do you think? Is it better to have this steady but slow progression, or a bit more aggressive language progression?
I think it's good for Ruby to actually evolve, and even at the cost of change and incompatibility with older programs, because it will definitely be a cleanup. 1.8 is around for a bunch of years now, and we had 1.6 before, and probably it's time for a change. The language designers learned a lot, and instead of carrying with us all the stuff that was built in earlier, maybe it just makes sense to cut that off and continue with a fresh base.
Okay. So that said, would you recommend Ruby in any project situation, or is it really more a prototyping language or whatever?
Well, I see different applications for it. One would definitely be, as Rails already proved that it's possible to work with Ruby in that area, web applications.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have the full cycle of support from the database to the web UI. You can apply the model view controller concept, and this is probably all you need, all you ever need for a web application.
Yeah.
So that's fine. Where I also would use Ruby is in the native, or say rich client programming model. So I wouldn't really go for Java, C# or other languages, but really use Ruby or Python or for those applications.
That's pretty strange. I never thought of Ruby as a GUI client, rich client, whatever language. I mean, I hope this is not too much flame bait. The UI frameworks I know for Ruby, they don't really have the Ruby feeling to me. They mostly seem to be a port of some framework that already exists into the Ruby space, but they are not that dynamic, and I miss the Ruby feeling. So I would never get the idea of doing a UI development with Ruby right now.
Yeah, I can understand that point, but you have two options. The one option is the platform independent way of developing Ruby UIs, and that will probably lead you to some kind of framework that you just mentioned. And I wouldn't follow that track because you lose a lot of native feeling on certain platforms. So a second option will be to use the language connectors to the specific windowing toolkits. And in the case of GNOME or KDE, that will be like really native adapters where you can use the widget set of the platform. And that works pretty well. There's an application out there called Alexandria, if I remember correctly. It's a library manager, and it's being deployed with a Windows toolkit adapter and I guess it's OS 10 adapter, and it feels natively, so you cannot tell that it's a Ruby application.
Okay.
It behaves natively.
Oh, pretty interesting. Didn't know that.
And the big benefit will be, of course, the speed of the development phase, right?
Yeah.
So instead of having the traditional build, compile, link, whatever cycle that is necessary. I mean, today there are even people out there that still use C or C++ for UIs, and it's just too much work, in my opinion.
Okay. So, given your prior experience with Java, where would you still use Java? Is there stuff you would do with Java anymore, or?
Yeah, definitely. The systems that I develop on a daily basis, they usually are more complex than web applications or native user interfaces. They work together with transaction monitors. They need whatever kind of protocol adapters to be monitored, like in the enterprise service world. I don't think you really have a replacement for Java if you think about Ruby. So that said, I still think there is a possibility to combine both and, for example, use Ruby for a web UI and for simple database access, and use whatever kind of remote service API to forward or to delegate operations to a, say, more complex system that involves messaging or like complex transactional behavior, something that's currently missing from Ruby entirely.
Okay, and I heard that the JRuby stuff gets more speed again, because it was quiet for a while in between, but it's getting speed again. So maybe that's another chance there to combine Ruby and Java more.
Definitely.
For the Java developers of our listeners, could you describe some Ruby features that Java doesn't have, or that you like very much and think Java developers should know of?
What I usually do when I program Ruby is a technique called duck typing. No, the point about duck typing is that a object doesn't have to belong to a certain type in order to implement functionality that you want to use as a programmer. So, for example, in Java, you have to implement interfaces or extend certain superclasses in order to get the functionality that you define somewhere else in the type hierarchy. In Ruby, you don't have to do that. And the duck typing technique just enables the programmer to, take whatever object and pass it into some kind of method. And if the method accepts that there exists some kind of other method, it's getting complicated. It needs a certain functionality from this object just being passed. And you just invoke that, typically not paying attention to whatever kind of type hierarchy. Since we don't have a static compilation step in between, the interpreter is fine. Just accepting the object, and of course you might end up with a runtime exception. But it's up to the programmer to catch that.
Yeah, that is really, I don't know how to explain it. It feels pretty strange from a Java programmer's perspective. I know this from Objective-C, for example, and it's so great. It's such a huge leap, and it sounds like a hack, because if it isn't whatever object or a subclass of the object, why should a method be able to deal with it? But there are so many situations where you can use it, and you would have to define hundreds of interfaces in Java to mimic the same thing. And of course you can, for example, do for print line or whatever, for every method define an interface, but you don't want to, of course. You have thousands of interfaces flying around and get a very complex system. Yes, I like this duck typing thing.
Exactly. I mean, this is how the Ruby people build up the standard library. Yeah. So you just... in your regular logic, you just pass in an array and you use a shift operator to add new elements.
Yeah.
And maybe another use for this very same operation would be to pass in a file object.
Yeah.
And the shift operator would append the data to the file without any change in the code. So that's beautiful.
Yeah, great. Other things?
What I also like is Mixins. I used Mixins before in languages like Objective-C, which had a close connection to Smalltalk, and of course the Smalltalk people knew everything that we have today. But that's something I really miss in the Java world, where you can define your a block of functionality and then just import it as a mixin. Again, in Java we have this inheritance problem. In order to overcome this inheritance thing, you have to use delegation, and Java doesn't even have great support for the delegation model. I mean, I wish they would have a delegate keyword where I could just say, well, those interface methods that I just inherited, they go to this delegation object, but instead I have to add like every single method that I want to delegate to another one. So
just to explain it a bit deeper, Mixins are code you can...
I can, basically what I do is I define in Ruby a module, and it has some kind of implementation of logic that I just want to share with other objects. So for example, simple example is logging, right?
Yeah.
So you have like the typical info, fatal, warn, error, whatever methods. And instead of re-implementing it, or instead of, like, for example, if you decide to, this is an option for you, instead of delegating it, you just mix in those methods into the object that we're just talking about. And then you're fine to use those methods as if they would belong to the very implementation of that object that you use.
It's a bit cleaner than multiple inheritance. I mean, in C++, we often use multiple inheritance to simulate it, and we didn't really have real ISA relationships to the base classes, but we needed to import some code to write it a few times, or to delegate, whatever. So multiple inheritance was often a not so nice hack to do things. Mixins do pretty clean, I think. Yeah.
Right. Fortunately, not a lot of people asked me to program C++ before. But I mean, from that statement, you can see my direction.
Yeah. Okay, could you say a few things on the meta-programming model? I think that's also very different from the Java world.
Okay, so the funny thing is, and I mentioned that before with the DSLs, the domain-specific languages, it's very easy to extend the Ruby language by your own keywords, concepts, whatever. Usually you do this using meta-programming, and that means you extend classes during runtime with additional behavior. How you do that, that's pretty magic. I mean, there's some kind of very complex internal mechanism to Ruby that you probably have to understand before you want to jump into that, because it has to do with visibility of instance variables and methods and all that kind of thing. But in the code itself, it comes down to applying the shift operator to a class, and then defining your methods, and they will append it to exactly this class that you just defined.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you can really at the runtime extend classes, single objects, add a new method to an object. I mean, that's very strange from the Java perspective again. So pretty dynamic, pretty powerful, but also, of course, you have various ways to shoot yourself in the knee if you don't know what to do. But I don't have the feeling right now that it's really that huge problem in practice.
Well, I think as long as developers know what they are doing and what they are asked for, that's fine. And probably the one example that really struck me was in Rails you have due to the meta programming mechanism, they extended the integer type so that you can say 4.days from now.
Yeah.
And I was looking up the standard library and I said, well, what's happening here? So I had to jump into the Rails documentation and see, well, they have exactly that class definition that extends the integer class.
Yeah.
So, and obviously they're not modifying the standard library on your hard disk, on your local machine, but they're doing that during runtime.
Yeah.
So the possibilities are...
Yeah. Yeah, well, but it also has a dark side within it. I mean, it's always, or it could at least be hard to read or understand a Ruby program if you are able to modify everything that's there. You have always to learn the environment, the program you're working in. So it's a different thing, I guess. I'm not sure if we... or how we fix this with documentation and stuff like that. I mean, the more complex and the more people are working on such a project, the harder this might get. I'm not sure on this.
I think it's always a two-stage problem because you have the framework developers that really have to provide that functionality, and of course they have to understand the language mechanism, just what I said about visibility and stuff and extensions. And then as a, say, application programmer, say you want to develop a Rails application, you don't have to understand that. You have to use it, or you can use it. And, it's...
Good method names are very important there, I guess. Yeah.
So, and the second thing, of course, we come back to to unit tests. Rails, for example, has a whole infrastructure set up to support the programmer in order to unit test the application. And, doing test-driven development all day in the Java world, I wouldn't start programming Ruby without tests anyway. But I can see there's even more need with those dynamic languages to unit test the applications on a more thorough basis.
Yeah. That's also interesting. I think we get more to the thing Smalltalk had, where the strong separation between language and framework and whole runtime environment gets more fuzzy. I mean, Ruby is, as you said, is framework, language, runtime. It's all more dependent on each other, therefore more powerful. Strange to see how we get back to the basics of Smalltalk on so many points. Yeah. Okay, so after done this project or prototyping project, I guess Ruby has also some problems, and there are some disadvantages of Ruby problems, caveats, whatever. Could you give us a few examples where should we take care not to do some problems and whatever?
Okay, so as a Java programmer, I'm really working with IDEs today that support my working style more efficiently than years before. Say we have refactorings, we have all these kind of things that simplify the life of a programmer. I don't have this with Ruby, and that's what I'm missing most. So I have to go back to using VI or whatever kind of editor. I mean, some people are using this TextMate thing, and it is really adapted towards Ruby. There's lots of support for Ruby programmers in there. I can't really judge on it because I've never used it before. But that's missing, and I want to have refactoring, and I want to have quick navigation within classes and not navigation on the file system. So if you're willing to accept those disadvantages, well, I mean, then I guess Ruby will definitely be a new thing that that's worth looking at. The other thing is, and I mentioned it before, Ruby is still moving. So if you decide today that you want to do a Rails app, and you, of course, have to make it work on the current stable tree, and that means the 1.8 version of Ruby, then you have to be prepared to, have a whole bunch of legacy running for years, or at some point cut the 1.8 off and like migrate your application. And nobody at this point can tell how much work that will be.
Yeah. So let me add a few words to the IDE stuff. I mentioned it in our first scripting language episode. We got some listener feedback on the refactoring topic especially. And a lot of people said you can't do refactoring without static typing, which is not true in my opinion. For example, the very first refactoring browser was actually a Smalltalk browser, so it has to work somehow. The point is, you have to implement your refactoring browser completely different. You can't build it up on the static type info you have. There's a lot of things you have to do at runtime inspections. For example, renaming a method is implemented in Smalltalk browser. They rename the method actually and implement another method with the same name as the old one to catch all the calls from the clients, and that's the way they can find out who is calling this method and then at runtime edit the callers. So it's completely different how to implement it. You have to shift a few things from compile time, which is not there of course, to runtime, but it's also you have possibilities you don't have with Java, because every time you have to work with an object, just create one and ask it for it. So you don't have to rely on type info. You can just ask your client or whatever object for the information you need. So it's definitely possible to build a refactoring browser for Ruby. It's hard to say if they are more powerful or less powerful than the refactoring browser we know from the static type languages. And this static versus dynamic thing is not the only criteria. Look at C++. We still have no real good, or at least I don't know of a real good refactoring browser because of all these .h files and the complex syntax and pre-compiled stuff. So it's a different thing. It has to be implemented different, but I'm pretty sure we will see good refactoring browsers for Ruby. It's just a matter of time. But back to my initial question, I always had the feeling that Ruby is a bit, how should I say it, redundantly defined. There are a lot of things, how to write a loop. I don't know, I've never counted them, but there are many, many ways how to write a simple loop. You can use an integer and the times method. You have for in, and a lot of things are redundantly defined, so I didn't like that so much. How's your feeling on this?
If you refer to while loops and unless and stuff, basically most of the time you're using the same loop constructs that you're using in other languages. But sometimes I see it's nice that I can write a loop in a very simple way using an unless or something. It may be a bit more complicated or maybe more unusual on the first glance, but I don't have a problem with that.
Okay. Any other thing we should consider when we work with Ruby?
So if you're not working on a server side and you have to deploy your code basically to customers, then you might have a problem because Ruby doesn't allow you to generate some kind of bytecode the way Python does. But as a consequence, your clients have access to your source code, or they can read whatever kind of intellectual property you put in there. So at this time, I prefer developing service applications using Ruby and web UIs and stuff, and not actually delivering rich clients to my customers.
Yeah, sure. It's so obfuscating wouldn't work, of course, with Ruby. I mean, you could rename the names of the methods, but still it's there, so it's not so...
Right, so smart people will always de-obfuscate the code.
Yeah.
I think currently there is a effort to generate C code from Ruby applications.
Okay. Didn't know this.
So that probably means that you can run the Ruby to C generator, compile your application soon, and then, that's something you can deliver.
Wow. However, they do all the dynamic stuff. I mean,
well, that's magic. I don't know anything about that.
Okay, so let's sum it up. What are the few highlights, key points you would sum up to our listeners?
I'd say Ruby works very well in real project situations where you can keep your source code on the server side and where your applications are not as complex as what you would solve with Java enterprise systems. That said, I want to connect Ruby applications ideally with the Java world to get the benefits of both. It's a good opportunity to learn about new concepts, like maybe changes your view on what you're currently doing on a daily basis. And I just recommend to look into Ruby.
Okay. Fine. Thanks a lot for the interview.
Thanks for having me.
This was another episode of Software Engineering Radio. The Software Engineering Radio team wants to thank Henning Pauli for providing the music, as well as Libsyn.com for hosting and bandwidth. For more information on the podcast, past episodes and feedback, go to se-radio.net.